I'm Deborah, 52 female. For 28 years, I lived in a house I designed myself, with a man I thought I knew inside and out, and raised a son who was my entire world. I am an architect, a woman who builds things meant to last, foundations, structures, families. But it turns out the most important foundation in my life was built on sand, and I was about to watch a hurricane tear it all down. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. If you had asked me 6 months ago to describe my life, I would have used words like stable, fulfilled, and happy. I lived in a beautiful, sun-drenched home in a quiet suburb, a home whose blueprints I had personally drawn 2 decades earlier. Every corner, every window placement was a testament to the life my husband, Richard, and I had built together. He was a successful financial advisor, the kind of man who inspired confidence with his calm demeanor and steady smile. At 54, he still had the same charm that had drawn me in when we were in college. We were that couple, the one who still held hands on walks, the one whose friends looked to as a model for a lasting marriage. We were just weeks away from our 28th wedding anniversary, and I was planning a large garden party to celebrate. Our son, Leo, was our greatest achievement. At 26, he was a kind, intelligent young man with a passion for history, which he taught at the local high school. He had his father's easy smile but my analytical mind. Seeing him grow into such a wonderful person was a source of deep, quiet pride for both Richard and me. Last year, Leo had brought home Chloe. She was vibrant, beautiful, and at 25, full of life. As a social media manager, she was fluent in a world of trends and technology that felt a million miles away from my world of blueprints and building codes. She was sweet to me, always calling me Mom D and complimenting my home, my cooking, my style. I welcomed her with open arms, thrilled that my son had found someone who made him so happy. They announced their engagement 6 months later, and our perfect family picture felt complete. We were not just gaining a daughter. We were looking forward to grandchildren, to a whole new chapter of family holidays and celebrations. I remember thinking how lucky I was. I had a thriving career, a loving husband, and a wonderful son who was about to start his own family. Chloe seemed to slot into our lives seamlessly. She'd come over for Sunday dinners, bubbling with stories about her work and wedding plans. She and Richard developed a surprisingly close bond. He was fascinated by her job, often asking her for tips on how to improve his firm's online presence. "This young lady is a genius, Deb," he'd say, beaming at her across the dinner table. "She's going to make our Leo a very happy man." I saw it as a good thing, a sign that our family was blending beautifully. He was treating her like the daughter he never had. The thought that there could be anything inappropriate about their bond never once crossed my mind. It was unthinkable. Why would I even consider it? He was her future father-in-law, a man nearly 30 years her senior. Looking back, the signs were there, but they were so subtle, so easily explained away, that seeing them for what they were would have required a level of cynicism I simply didn't possess. There was the time I saw Richard showing Chloe a new feature on his phone, their heads bent close together, his hand lingering on her arm just a second too long. I dismissed it as fatherly affection. There was the expensive bracelet Richard bought her for her birthday. "It's a welcome to the family gift," he had explained, and Leo had beamed, so I did too. How could I question a gesture that made my son so happy? There were inside jokes between them that I wasn't privy to, quick glances across the room that ended the moment I looked their way. I interpreted it all as a positive sign. They were getting along. I was so wrapped up in my vision of a perfect, harmonious family that I was blind to the rot spreading right under my nose. I was busy designing additions to our home in my mind, making space for future grandchildren, while the very foundation was cracking. The preparations for our anniversary party were in full swing. I'd hired caterers, ordered flowers, and sent out dozens of invitations. It was meant to be a celebration of our enduring love, a milestone that proved we had weathered all of life's storms together. Richard was more involved than usual, which I found touching. He had strong opinions on the music, the wine selection, and even the color of the napkins. Chloe was a huge help, of course. She designed the digital invitations and managed the RSVPs online. Teamwork makes the dream work, she'd chirp, linking her arm through mine as we went the seating chart. One afternoon, while we were finalizing the menu, she put her hand on my arm, her eyes wide and sincere. "Deborah, you and Richard are my inspiration," she said. 28 years, that's incredible. I hope Leo and I can have a love story just like yours." I hugged her, my heart swelling with warmth. She was everything I could have hoped for in a daughter-in-law, or so I thought. The irony is so thick it chokes me now. My love story was the one she wanted, and she was willing to destroy it to have a piece of it for herself. The party was set for a Saturday evening. Our friends and family would gather in the garden I had so lovingly cultivated, under the glow of string lights, to toast to our love. I had bought a beautiful new dress and a special, heartfelt gift for Richard, a vintage watch, engraved with the coordinates of the spot where he first proposed. Everything was perfect. It was the calm before the storm, the deep, deceptive peace before the world imploded. The night of the party was perfect, almost unnervingly so. The late summer air was warm, carrying the scent of jasmine from the trellis I had trained along the garden wall. String lights crisscrossed the yard, casting a magical, golden glow over our guests. Friends and family milled about on the lawn, their laughter mingling with the soft, jazz music playing from discreetly placed speakers. Richard was the perfect host, moving through the crowd with a glass of champagne in hand, his arm draped easily around my shoulders. He'd pull me close, kiss my temple, and whisper, "28 years, my love, and you're more beautiful than ever." I felt a blush rise to my cheeks, the same way it did when we were 24. From the outside, we were the picture of happiness, the embodiment of a successful marriage. Leo and Chloe were there, looking every bit the happy young couple. Chloe, in a slinky red dress, was a magnet for attention, but she always made sure to keep a hand on Leo's arm, looking up at him with adoring eyes. At one point, I watched her have an animated conversation with Richard's business partner. Richard came up behind her, placed his hands on her shoulders in a seemingly fatherly gesture, and steered her away, saying, "Let me rescue you from him. He'll talk your ear off about stocks." They both laughed, and it looked so innocent. As the evening wore on, it was time for toasts. Leo went first, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke about growing up in a house filled with love and respect. "My parents taught me what a true partnership looks like," he said, raising his glass to us. "They are the standard I hope to live up to with Chloe, to Mom and Dad." Tears welled in my eyes. It was everything a mother could want to hear. Richard spoke next, his speech eloquent and charming. He talked about the day we met, our struggles as a young couple, and the joy of building our life together. He looked directly at me, his eyes sincere. "Deborah," he said, his voice dropping to an intimate tone that made the crowd hush, "you are the architect of my happiness. Every good thing in my life started with you. I love you more today than ever before." The applause was thunderous. I felt like the luckiest woman in the world, blissfully unaware that I was the star of a meticulously crafted play, and the final act was about to bring the whole theater down. Later, after we had cut the cake and the party had settled into a comfortable rhythm of conversations and dancing, I decided it was time to give Richard his gift. The vintage watch was nestled in a beautiful cherrywood box in my dressing room upstairs. I wanted to give it to him in private, away from the crowd. I looked around the garden for him but couldn't spot him. Chloe was also nowhere to be seen, but I figured she was in the powder room or helping my sister with something in the kitchen. I asked Leo if he'd seen his father. "I think he went inside a few minutes ago," he said, gesturing toward the house. "Said he needed to take a call in his office where it's quieter." That made sense. His office was at the end of the hall on the ground floor, a quiet sanctuary filled with dark wood and leather-bound books. I smiled, thinking it was the perfect place for our private moment. I went upstairs first to retrieve the gift. The weight of the box in my hands felt significant, a symbol of the time we had spent together. With a happy, expectant heart, I made my way back downstairs and down the hallway to his office. The door was slightly ajar and the lights were off. I could hear hushed voices from inside. I assumed he was still on his call and paused, not wanting to interrupt. But then I heard Chloe's voice, a low, throaty laugh that was nothing like her usual cheerful chirp. Curiosity turned to a vague, unformed unease. I pushed the door open just a little more, peering into the dim room. The sliver of light from the hallway illuminated a scene that didn't compute. My brain simple. Why refuse to process it for a few seconds? They weren't on the phone. They were standing by his desk, their bodies pressed together. Richard's hands were tangled in Chloe's hair and his mouth was on hers. It wasn't a fleeting, accidental kiss. It was deep, passionate, and sickeningly familiar. It was the way he used to kiss me. For a moment, I was paralyzed, frozen in the doorway. The cherrywood box slipped from my fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a loud crack. The sound broke the spell. They sprang apart, their faces a mixture of shock and horror, their eyes wide in the dim light like startled animals. Chloe's red dress was slightly askew and Richard's tie was loosened. The air was thick with their betrayal. "Deborah," Richard stammered, taking a step toward me, his hands raised as if to ward off a blow. "It's not what it looks like." The cliché was so absurd, so insulting, that it broke through my shock and unleashed a wave of cold fury. Not what it looks like. My voice was unnaturally calm, a stark contrast to the earthquake happening inside me. "It looks like you're kissing our son's fiancée, in your office, during our anniversary party." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. The architect in me took over, assessing the structural failure with a detached, chilling clarity. The entire framework of my life, the load-bearing walls of my marriage and family, had just crumbled into dust. Chloe started to cry, a pathetic, hiccuping sound. "Deborah, I am so sorry," she sobbed, clutching the front of her dress. "It was a mistake. It just happened." Richard rushed to her side, putting a comforting arm around her, and that single gesture was the final blow. In a moment of crisis, he chose her. He moved to comfort the woman he was cheating with, not the wife of 28 years he had just shattered. I looked at the two of them, huddled together in the dark, and I felt nothing but a profound, icy emptiness. The warmth of the party, the laughter of our friends, the love I had felt just moments before, it all evaporated. I turned without another word, leaving the watch box broken on the floor, a perfect, tragic symbol of our shattered time together. I walked back through my beautiful home, past the smiling faces of my guests, and out into the garden. I found Leo, took him by the arm, and said, "We need to go." The look on his face, the confusion and concern, is a memory that will be seared into my mind forever. He knew something was terribly wrong. He just had no idea how terribly. The drive to my sister's house was a blur of silence and streetlights. Leo sat in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing at me with worried eyes, but he didn't press for details. He could feel the seismic shift, the raw, unprocessed grief radiating from me. I couldn't have formed the words to explain it anyway. How do you tell your son that his father and his fiancée have just detonated a bomb in the middle of your family? When we arrived at my sister Clara's, I finally broke down. The story came out in ragged, ugly sobs, each word a fresh stab of pain. Clara held me while Leo stood in the living room, his face pale, his expression moving from confusion to disbelief, and finally to a look of such profound devastation it mirrored my own. Seeing his pain was somehow worse than feeling mine. He was the true innocent in this, a casualty of a war he didn't even know was being fought. He sank onto the sofa, his head in his hands, and didn't say a word for nearly an hour. The silence in that room was deafening, filled with the ghosts of our shattered family. By the time I returned home late the next morning, the house was empty. The remnants of the party, stray napkins, a few forgotten glasses, were the only evidence of the happy life that had existed just 12 hours before. Richard and Chloe were gone. Richard had left a note on the kitchen counter. A single, pathetic page of platitudes and excuses. He wrote that he was deeply sorry for the pain he had caused. He claimed the kiss was a moment of weakness, a terrible mistake fueled by champagne and the emotion of the evening. He begged for a chance to talk, to fix what he had broken. It was a coward's letter, full of empty words that took no real ownership of his actions. He didn't mention Chloe by name, referring to her only as the situation. It was a pathetic attempt to minimize the scale of his betrayal, to reduce the woman he had chosen over me to a mere circumstance. I crumpled the note and threw it in the trash. It was garbage, just like the 28 years of lies he had apparently been living. The real confrontation happened 2 days later. Richard called, his voice strained, and I agreed to meet him at the house. I needed answers, and I needed to look him in the eye when he gave them to me. He arrived looking haggard, but he wasn't alone. Chloe was with him, clinging to his arm like a life raft. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, but I found I had no sympathy for our tears. They were weapons designed to elicit pity and forgiveness that she hadn't earned. They stood before me in the living room I had designed, and they began to spin their web of lies. "It only happened once, Deb," Richard began, his voice pleading. "The party was the first and only time. We both regret it more than you can imagine." Chloe nodded vigorously, her lip trembling. "He's right, Deborah. It was a stupid, horrible mistake. I love Leo, and I was so overwhelmed by everything. The wedding, joining your amazing family, I got confused." Confused? She thought a passionate kiss with her future father-in-law was a symptom of confusion? The excuses were so flimsy, so insulting to my intelligence, that my grief began to curdle into a cold, hard anger. I was an architect. I dealt in facts, in precise measurements and unyielding truths. Their story was a poorly constructed facade, and I could already see the cracks. I asked them where they went after the party. Richard claimed he had taken Chloe to a hotel to calm her down and that he had slept on the sofa in her room. He painted himself as a caretaker, a concerned father figure helping a distraught young woman. The narrative was as absurd as it was disgusting. I looked at Chloe and asked her one question directly. "Are you still planning on marrying my son?" She had the audacity to look shocked, as if this were a possibility. "Of course." She cried, reaching for my hand, which I pulled away. "I love Leo." This meant nothing. Richard was just being supportive. "We can get past this, all of us." The all of us was what broke my composure. The idea that we would somehow move forward as one big, happy, dysfunctional family was the ultimate insult. That I would sit across the holiday table from her and my husband, knowing what they had done, was unthinkable. But I wasn't prepared for the final, devastating blow. I told them their story was unbelievable and that I didn't buy a word of it. Richard's face hardened, the remorseful mask slipping to reveal a hint of anger. "Deborah, you're not listening. We're trying to be honest with you." It was then that Chloe, perhaps realizing her tears weren't working, decided to play her trump card. She took a deep breath, placed a hand on her stomach, and looked from Richard to me. "There's something else," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. For a split second, there was a flicker of hope. A baby, Leo's baby. Maybe this was the thing that would force us to find a way through the wreckage. Maybe for the sake of a grandchild. But then I looked at Richard. His face was ashen. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at Chloe's stomach with an expression I couldn't decipher. It wasn't the joy of a future grandfather. It was something else. Fear, guilt, ownership. And in that sickening moment, I knew. The lie they were telling me wasn't just about a kiss. The web was far more tangled and far more horrifying than I could have imagined. "Is it Leo's?" I asked, my voice flat. Chloe burst into fresh tears, but this time they were different. They were the frantic tears of someone whose carefully constructed lie had just been exposed. She couldn't answer. She just sobbed. But Richard's face, his utter devastation, his failure to meet my eyes, told me everything I needed to know. The baby wasn't my grandchild. It was a monument to their betrayal, and it was growing in the belly of the woman who was supposed to marry my son. The pregnancy announcement was not a confession. It was a strategic move, a desperate gambit to force a resolution. But it backfired spectacularly. Instead of making me feel trapped, it severed the last thread of any possible reconciliation. The shock was immense, but underneath it, a cold, methodical clarity began to form. My grief was still there, a heavy cloak I couldn't shrug off, but now it was joined by a steely resolve. I was no longer a victim in a tragedy. I was an investigator at a crime scene. And the first thing I needed was a good lawyer. Fortunately, I already had one. My best friend of 30 years, Isabel, was one of the sharpest family law attorneys in the state. I called her that same afternoon, my voice trembling as I recounted the entire sordid story. She listened patiently, without interruption, the way only a true friend and a seasoned professional can. When I finished, there was a brief silence on the line. "Deb," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "First, I'm so sorry. Second, do not speak to Richard or Chloe again without me present. Third, we are going to dismantle him, methodically." Her words were a lifeline. She gave me a clear set of instructions, a blueprint for what to do next. My mind, so accustomed to structure and planning, latched onto it. This was a problem I could solve. It wasn't about building a house. It was about demolishing one, but the principles of careful planning were the same. The first step was gather evidence. Their story about the affair being a one-time mistake at the party was a lie, and I needed to prove it. Isabel advised me to get access to our shared phone records and credit card statements. Since my name was on the accounts, it was surprisingly easy. I spent a long, painful weekend poring over months of data, a highlighter in my hand, and a pit of acid in my stomach. The truth began to emerge, one damning transaction at a time. It hadn't started a few weeks ago. It started nearly 8 months ago, shortly after Leo and Chloe got engaged. There were hotel charges on Richard's credit card, boutique hotels in nearby towns for afternoons when he was supposedly at a client meeting. There were lunches at expensive, intimate restaurants for two, paid for on days he told me he was eating a sandwich at his desk. I cross-referenced the dates with text messages from him. Long day at the office, honey. Don't wait up. The lies were so blatant, so casual. He had woven this deception into the fabric of our daily lives. The phone records were even more revealing. Hundreds of calls and texts between him and Chloe, not just during the day, but late at night, long after I had gone to sleep. I saw calls made from our home while I was sleeping in the next room to her apartment across town. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to run to the bathroom. The intimacy of it, the sheer audacity, was staggering. He hadn't just cheated, he had brought his affair into our bed, into the sanctuary of our home. I also found the receipts for gifts. The expensive bracelet he'd given her for her birthday wasn't a welcome to the family gift. It was one of many. There were designer handbags, spa gift certificates, even a charge for a weekend getaway package at a vineyard resort 3 months prior, a weekend he told me he was attending a financial conference. I remembered that weekend clearly. He had called me, telling me how boring the seminars were, how much he missed me. All of it was a lie. He was there with her, the woman who was supposed to be our daughter. The worst discovery came from an old, shared family tablet we kept in the kitchen. Richard often used it to read the news, and he had forgotten to log out of his personal email. Against Isabel's advice to let a professional handle digital forensics, I couldn't resist. I opened his account, my heart pounding, and there it was, a folder labeled Projects. It wasn't for work. It was filled with emails between him and Chloe. Love letters, essentially. They wrote about their secret love, their unfortunate circumstances, and their plans for a future together. They talked about me. Richard described me as a wonderful woman, but said we had grown apart, that our marriage had become more of a comfortable partnership than a romance. He wrote that Chloe made him feel young and alive. Chloe, in her emails, was even more cruel. She wrote about feeling guilty, but that her love for Richard was the most real thing in her life. She wrote about her fears of hurting Leo, but in the same breath, she talked about how she and Richard would eventually tell him the truth when the time was right. They were planning to destroy my son. They were casting him as a temporary obstacle in their great romance. It was then that I understood the pregnancy wasn't an accident. It was their solution. They thought a baby would force the issue, create a situation so permanent and undeniable that everyone else would just have to accept it. They thought it would give them a shortcut to the future they wanted, a future built on the ruins of the family they were tearing apart. With every email, every receipt, every phone log, the picture became clearer. This was not a moment of weakness. It was a calculated, long-term betrayal of the highest order. My husband and my son's fiancée had conspired against us, and I now had all the evidence I needed to prove it. The architect in me had the blueprints of their deceit. Now, it was time to design their demolition. The weeks following my investigation were a strange, surreal limbo. I moved into the guest room, creating a cold, silent barrier in the home we had once shared. Richard tried to talk to me, to breach the wall I had erected, but I refused. I communicated only through brief, necessary texts about household matters. He and Chloe were still putting on a show for Leo, who, in his grief and confusion, had distanced himself from everyone. He wasn't speaking to his father and had told Chloe he needed space. He had no idea about the true depth of the affair or the questionable paternity of the baby. He just knew about the kiss, and for him, that was devastating enough. I held the rest of the evidence close, a cache of ammunition waiting for the right moment. The temptation to just explode, to throw the printouts of the emails and credit card bills in their faces, was immense. But Isabel counseled patience. An emotional outburst gives them power, she explained during one of our late-night strategy sessions. A calculated, undeniable presentation of facts leaves them with nothing. We don't just want you to win, Deborah. We want you to be in complete control of how this ends. She was right. I had spent my life designing structures that were logical, stable, and built to withstand pressure. I would approach the end of my marriage the same way. This wouldn't be a messy, emotional collapse, it would be a controlled demolition. My first step under Isabel's guidance was to secure my finances. Richard, the financial advisor, had managed our wealth for our entire marriage. I had trusted him implicitly, signing documents without a second thought. Now, that trust was a liability. Isabel brought in a forensic accountant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Maria, who began to meticulously untangle our shared assets. It was a slow, painstaking process. We discovered that Richard had been siphoning money from our joint investment accounts for months, moving it into a private account under his name only. It was the account he used to pay for the hotels, the gifts, the entire secret life he was leading with Chloe. He was literally funding his affair with our shared future. The betrayal stung, but the discovery was a gift. It was financial infidelity, a clear breach of trust that would give me significant leverage in the divorce proceedings. We also secured my architectural firm. It was my own business, which I had started before our son was born. Maria and Isabel helped me restructure it to ensure it was protected, a separate entity that he couldn't touch. Every day, I went to work, immersing myself in blueprints and client meetings. My work became my sanctuary, a place where logic reigned and I was in control. While my personal life was in ruins, I was creating beautiful, functional spaces for other families. The irony was not lost on me. While the financial groundwork was being laid, I focused on Leo. He was adrift, shattered by what he thought was a single moment of betrayal. I knew I had to tell him the whole truth, but the timing had to be perfect. I couldn't just drop this information on him. I had to present it in a way that left no room for doubt or for his father's manipulation. So I waited. I watched as Richard and Chloe continued their charade. Chloe would send Leo long, tearful texts, which he would show me. She spoke of her terrible mistake and her undying love for him. Richard would call him, talking about forgiveness and family. They were trying to manage the fallout, to salvage what they could of their relationship with my son, all while hiding the true extent of their deception. I realized their greatest fear was Leo finding out the whole truth. They knew he was the one person whose forgiveness they desperately needed and whose judgment they feared the most. And that became the centerpiece of my plan. The final confrontation would not be for my benefit, it would be for Leo's. He deserved to see his father and his ex-fiancée for who they truly were, without their masks of feigned remorse. The plan came together piece by piece, like a complex architectural design. Isabel would file for divorce on a Friday morning. That same evening, I would call a family meeting at the house. I would tell Richard and Chloe that it was time to talk, to figure out how to move forward for Leo's sake. I knew they would come. They would see it as their chance to control the narrative, to push their story of a one-time mistake and beg for forgiveness. I invited my sister Clara to be there as a neutral witness and a support for both me and Leo. The stage was set. I had 3 identical folders prepared. Each one contained copies of the credit card statements with the hotel and gift purchases highlighted, the phone records showing the late-night calls, and printouts of their most incriminating emails. It was a complete, undeniable timeline of their affair. On the top of each pile of documents, I placed a copy of a formal request for a paternity test for Chloe's unborn child, which Isabel had drafted. The evening would not be a screaming match. It would be a quiet, orderly presentation of the facts. I was an architect, after all. And this was the most important design of my life, the blueprint for my own freedom and my son's liberation from their lies. The day I chose was a cool Friday in October. That morning, as planned, Isabel electronically filed the divorce petition with the court. Richard was served via email at his office at precisely 10:00 a.m. His panicked, angry text messages started almost immediately. "What is this, Deborah? We were supposed to talk. You can't just do this." I didn't respond. I simply sent one calm, measured text back. "We will talk, tonight our house. 7 p.m., be here with Chloe. We are going to resolve this for Leo's sake." His text stopped. He must have interpreted my message as an olive branch, a sign that the divorce filing was a tactic and that I was still open to negotiation. He couldn't have been more wrong. By the time 7 p.m. rolled around, the atmosphere in my living room was thick with tension. I had arranged the seating carefully. I sat in my usual armchair, with my sister Clara on the sofa to my left. Leo sat on the other end of the sofa, his face a mask of anxious exhaustion. He knew this meeting was important, but he had no idea what was about to unfold. I had the 3 manila folders sitting on the coffee table in front of me. Richard and Chloe arrived together, a united front. Richard wore a somber suit, trying to look like a serious, responsible man taking charge of a difficult situation. Chloe was dressed conservatively in a loose-fitting dress, her small baby bump just beginning to show. She clutched Richard's arm, her eyes downcast, playing the part of the penitent, fragile woman. They sat on the love seat opposite us, facing their jury. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "I asked you here tonight because Leo deserves the truth, and we are all going to finally be honest." Richard immediately launched into his rehearsed speech. "Deborah, I'm so glad we're doing this," he said, leaning forward earnestly. "Filing for divorce was a shock, but I understand you're hurt. Chloe and I have talked a lot. What happened was a terrible, isolated mistake. We are both so sorry, and we want to do whatever it takes to earn back your trust, and especially yours, Leo." Chloe nodded, a single tear tracing a perfect path down her cheek. "Leo," she whispered, looking at him with wide, pleading eyes, "I love you. What I did was unforgivable, but it had nothing to do with you and me. Please, can we find a way to move past this?" My son looked at them, his heart in his eyes. He was so torn, so desperate to believe them. I could see him wavering. This was my cue. "I appreciate your apologies," I said calmly, "but the story you're telling isn't the truth." I picked up one of the folders from the coffee table and slid it across to them. "This is the truth." Richard's eyes narrowed. He opened the folder, and Chloe leaned in to look. I watched their faces as they saw the first page, the highlighted credit card bill showing the charge for the Vineyard Resort. I saw Richard's confident facade begin to crumble. He flipped the page to the hotel bills in the city, then to the receipts for the designer handbags. With each page, the color drained from their faces. Chloe let out a small, strangled gasp. "What is this?" Richard blustered, trying to sound indignant, but his voice shook. "You went through my things." "Our things, Richard," I corrected him gently. "It's our joint account, the one you've been using to fund your affair for the last 8 months. I then pushed a second folder towards Leo. "Leo," I said softly, "I'm so sorry, but you need to see this." He hesitated, looking from me to his father. Then he opened it. He saw the same evidence, the same timeline of deceit. I watched as my son's world fell apart for the second time, but this time it was illuminated by the harsh, ugly light of the truth. He looked at the phone records, the late-night calls. He looked at the emails. I saw his hands tremble as he read his father's words about our marriage being a partnership and Chloe's words about their secret love. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rustling of paper. When Leo finally looked up, his expression was no longer one of grief. It was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at his father. "You were with her, while Mom was asleep in the room next door?" Richard couldn't speak. Leo then turned his gaze to Chloe. "You told me you loved me," he said, his voice cracking with betrayal. "You were writing these emails to my father and then coming to my apartment and sleeping in my bed. How could you?" Chloe started sobbing, real desperate sobs this time. "It's not that simple," she cried. "We didn't mean for it to happen." "Then let's simplify it," I said, my voice like ice. I picked up the third folder and took out the top sheet of paper. I placed it on the table in front of them all. It was the formal request for a paternity test. "Chloe, you're pregnant," I stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "And Leo has a right to know if he is the father." That was the final, devastating blow. Richard slumped back into the love seat as if he'd been punched. Chloe stared at the paper, her mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. The lie was over. There was nowhere left for them to hide. Leo stared at the paper, then at Chloe's stomach, then at his father's guilty face. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the look on his face was one of horror and revulsion. He stood up slowly. He looked at Richard and Chloe, huddled together on the love seat, a pathetic tableau of their own making. "You too," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "And revulsion are the most disgusting people I have ever known. Stay away from me, both of you." He turned and walked out of the room, and I heard the front door slam shut. I looked at Richard and Chloe. They were broken, exposed, and utterly defeated. "My lawyer has a copy of all of this," I said quietly, gesturing to the folders. "The divorce is filed. I want you out of my house, tonight." Richard just nodded, unable to even look at me. My work was done. The demolition was complete. The aftermath of that night was not a sudden, clean peace, but the slow, messy process of clearing away rubble. True to my word, Richard packed a bag and left that evening, moving into a soulless corporate apartment downtown. Chloe disappeared from our lives entirely. The divorce was surprisingly swift. Faced with the mountain of evidence of both personal and financial infidelity, Richard's lawyer advised him not to fight. He knew a protracted court battle would only air more of his dirty laundry. Isabel was magnificent, securing a settlement that was more than fair. I kept the house I had designed and built, and a significant portion of our assets, including the money he had tried to hide. It wasn't about the money. It was about justice. It was about ensuring that the future he had tried to steal from me was the one thing he couldn't have. He had to sell his prized sports car and downsize his lifestyle significantly. The financial advisor, who had prided himself on his cleverness, had been thoroughly outmaneuvered. The paternity test, as we all knew it would, confirmed that Richard was the father of Chloe's baby. I heard through the grapevine that she had a girl. I felt a momentary pang of sadness for that innocent child, born into such a toxic situation, but I hardened my heart. Her life was not my responsibility. Richard and Chloe stayed together, not out of love, I suspect, but out of a shared exile. They were pariahs in our social circle. News of the affair, especially the part about Chloe being Leo's fiancée, had spread like wildfire. Friends who had toasted our marriage at our anniversary party now crossed the street to avoid speaking to Richard. His business suffered. People, it turns out, don't like entrusting their life savings to a man with no integrity. They moved to a different city a few months later, seeking anonymity. I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only a quiet, detached sense of consequence. They had made their choices, and now they were living with them. The most important part of the recovery was Leo. He was deeply wounded, his trust in people, especially those he loved, completely shattered. He had lost his father and the woman he planned to marry in one fell swoop. The first few months were difficult. He threw himself into his work, teaching his history classes with a detached professionalism. He came for dinner every Sunday, and we would talk for hours, not always about the betrayal, but about life, about history, about the future. We were two survivors, helping each other navigate the wreckage. Slowly, with time and therapy, he began to heal. He learned to separate the man his father was from the man he had pretended to be. He mourned the loss of the family he thought he had, but he began to see the strength in the small, resilient family we were now, just the two of us, my sister and a few close friends. About a year after that terrible night, he met a fellow teacher, a kind, genuine woman named Sarah. Watching him with her is like watching the sun come out after a long storm. He is cautious, but he is happy. He is building something new on a foundation of honesty this time. As for me, I found a surprising sense of freedom in the solitude. The house, which I feared would feel empty and haunted by memories, instead felt cleansed. It was mine again. I reclaimed the space, redecorating, moving furniture, filling the rooms with new art and music. My work flourished. I took on more ambitious projects, designing homes for other people with a renewed sense of purpose. I knew, more than ever, the importance of a solid foundation, both literally and metaphorically. One afternoon, about 2 years after the divorce, I was standing on a construction site, looking over the blueprints for a new community center I was designing. The sun was warm on my back, and the air smelled of fresh-cut lumber and possibility. My phone buzzed with a text from Leo. It was a picture of him and Sarah, smiling on a hike. The caption read, "Perfect day. Love you, Mom." I smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. I thought about Richard and Chloe, wherever they were, and I felt nothing. No anger, no bitterness, just a profound sense of detachment. They were a chapter of my life that was over, a structure that had been condemned and demolished. I was the architect of my own life. I had survived the collapse, cleared the debris, and was now building something new, something beautiful, something entirely my own. And T. His time, I knew without a doubt, the foundation was unshakable.